Hello, everyone, and welcome to Out of Nowhere. It's a brand new show. We've been going about 6 months or 7 months now. We have lots of fantastic guests from all over the world. But today, my good friend Mark Florentino is my guest today. Mark is the author of Master of Reality, which is a book about the completion of Einstein's unified field theory. Can we please welcome Mark to the show? Hello there.
Hello. It's good to be here, Bob.
Thank you, Mark, for coming on the show. Um, I know you in your childhood you was very interested in Albert Einstein.
Yeah, I guess I'll use that as an opening to explain what I need to explain tonight. I've had a diagnosis of cancer, so I need to get this information out as much as possible. Yeah, let me announce first that what I'm going to tell you tonight is how to build an anti-gravity aircraft. The discovery of gravity 1 and gravity 2 and anti-gravity. So with that in mind, and I'm going to give you a teaser or whatever. It
Yeah,
comes from the dipole technology, or north and south pole. And it will all be clear later. When you create a really strong dipole, you can create an anti-gravity field. So let me start with answering your question about how I got into studying physics and Einstein when I was 10 years old. Yes, the nuns at my church asked me to, and other people in our class, to go find a saint born on our birthday. When I went home to my parents and I looked on the calendar, the only thing I saw on the calendar for March 14th was Albert Einstein's birthday. So I went and looked him up and became very fascinated by the man, his history, his discoveries, and particularly the unified field theory, which I kept in my mind. I read it that day. It seems to me it was from James Clerk Maxwell had written an article on it in Encyclopedia Britannica. And I said, this is the best idea I've ever seen. And I want to try and figure it out. I think they're on the right track. And so from that day forward, I started reading about Einstein, the theories of relativity, and I stayed with that even through my teenage years, where I got interested in UFOs, and I see, these crafts seem to be able to be propelled without any sort of propulsion system that like what we use. No jets, no rockets, no motors, no propellers. They know how to generate. I just figured it out. It's just simple. I'm sure a lot of other people did too. Somehow, using electromagnetism, they created an anti-gravity field. And so my quest was to, from that point on, to solve the unified field theory, which is something most people are not familiar with. So I'm going to explain that to you right now. It's actually very simple and straightforward. Electromagnetism, which I split back into the electrostatic field dipole and the magnetic field dipole, and gravity emerge as aspects of a single fundamental field, which means everything is built from the single fundamental field. Now, this is not a new idea. It's been around for centuries. And it was what everybody believed up into the year 1905, when Einstein came out with the theory of special relativity, and a person, Michelson Morley, the Michelson and Morley, two scientists, did an experiment to detect the ether wind. Why was this important? because the hypothetical ether was thought of as being the fundamental field. So if we proved that it existed, then we would prove that Einstein's idea of a unified field theory was the right course of action. Unfortunately, that experiment, the Michelson-Morley experiment, was a flawed experiment. It used the particle called the photon to determine the Earth's rate of motion through the ether. And it did not detect it because what they didn't know then, until Einstein said it, I mean, you logically understand it after the experiment is run and it doesn't find an ether wind, that the speed of light is always the same no matter what frame of reference you're looking at from. Doesn't matter whether you, for instance, let's say you're in a train and you pick up a flashlight and you hold it and shine it onto the wall in front of you. The speed of that light particle is independent of the motion of the train. So you will measure the speed of light and going forward. And if you turn around and go to the forward and point the light beam to the back, it still will be the speed of light, independent from the motion of the train. So they didn't really get that clearly back then. If they really understood that deeply, they would realize that the photon, that particle, moves independently, which means it moves on its own. Its motion comes from the structure of the photon. And it doesn't matter whether that structure, that photon is on a frame of reference that's moving. It will be emitted from that object at the speed of light. So they used the wrong particle to detect the ether wind. And I spent years trying to understand why didn't that experiment work? And I realized finally that it was because the photon itself was the cause of its own motion, nothing else. It didn't matter. It got none of its motion. Let's say like you throw a baseball. That baseball gets all of its motion externally from your arm. That's not the way photons work. They're just emitted. They pop out of an atom and shoot in a certain direction. And from the moment they pop out, they're going at the speed of light until something absorbs them. And it doesn't matter how that thing is moving through the ether. So you'll never get the motion of the thing moving from the ether using a photon in the experiment, because a photon always moves at the speed of light because it gets its motion from its internal self, nothing else. You don't add any speed to it. You don't subtract any speed from it. The motion of which the object is that's emitting it or receiving it makes no difference. The only thing that happens is the Doppler effect, which means that the wavelength will be shortened or increased depending on your motion to it. So, and that we use in everyday life. Police officers use it to determine the motion of your car relative to the ground and relative to his car. If it's stationary, then you beam out the light and it comes back and the beam is compressed somewhat. You're going to see, whoa, that guy is going fast as he comes toward you. Now, as he goes away, it'll be stretched out. So the important thing was in 1905, everybody abandoned the ether because Einstein put in his paper that he didn't need an ether. But listen to what I'm saying. This is very important. Einstein was already tracking the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment. He knew it was going to be announced that the speed of light was constant. And so he had to figure out an alternate explanation because all of the math, the Lorentz transformations within his theory were based on the ether theory model. So it was going to immediately get discarded. And he knew that. So he put special wording into the document for the special theory of relativity to disavow the ether, even though all the formulas used to compute it come from an ether model from Antoine Lorentz and Hendrik Antoine Lorentz. So Lorentz was right. So Newton was right. So Maxwell was right. And they all believed in the ether. And at the time of that experiment, the ether was believed. We're going to go back to the definition I gave you. Electromagnetism and gravity emerge as aspects of a single fundamental field. I now knew the fundamental field was true. It was the ether. So I had to determine its properties. And it had already been done by Lorentz. It was a quasi-elastic solid. So the fundamental field is the only thing that exists. The one and only thing. All the rest of the universe is made up of particles that exist within the fundamental field. So now we have the truth. The fundamental field, the ether, does exist. And if we redid the experiment using particles with mass, a photon has no mass, and generates all of its speed from itself, you need to get a particle that doesn't do that, a particle that has inertia. And then you will detect the difference in the speed of light, because the motion of that particle in part comes from the motion of the object that emits it or receives it. And so I went looking in for articles written in that were about particle acceleration, the big ones that throw the particle around in a circle going miles across. Those particles, they use protons, they use neutrons, they use electrons, all particles with mass. Particles with mass will show the difference in the motion of the Earth as it's going one way and then 6 months later going the other way. And I looked for something to be noticed around the December-January timeframe. Why? Why did I pick that? Because that's when the Earth is closest to the sun and moving the fastest. It's the most likely point in which you would detect it. Then I went and looked for somebody that said, I'm having problems with the beam in December and January. And I found somebody. I wish I had seen an article. So at the time, I had no idea how important that article was. And this guy was complaining around late December, early January, the particle beam timing would go off. And he tried to explain it. Well, I think it's groundwater, but that doesn't make sense because the groundwater would affect the particle beam the whole way around its gravitational field. It wouldn't be different in one set of tunnels and different in the other. And that's exactly what he was seeing. So that one experiment does confirm the ether. And trying to bring that up to somebody at one of those places, they would laugh at you and deny it, because that's what way scientists are. They don't accept these newer ideas. They do everything via quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics doesn't really believe in an ether. So I, in my own mind, have now firmly established there is an ether. And so the way to generate a gravitational field is by the motion of particles, accelerated motion. And in my book, I talk about that. And there's a chapter in it, and a chapter that explains how particles move. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but inside of a neutron or a proton, the quarks that are inside are moving like this. Right. Foil knot. There you go. And that is what generates the mass. Because I discovered while writing my book that unbalanced charges that move in accelerated motion, and that form, that geometric structure where the quarks are moving in the trefoil knot pattern, is a accelerated. A lot of people don't know this, but curved motion is accelerated motion. Einstein linked acceleration to gravity, but they didn't know the mechanical aspect. I do now, and it's in my book. And so I searched for anywhere where I could find where Einstein said gravity and contraction of space. Gravity causes a contraction of space because the three quarks moving in that shape, that pattern, inside of the neutron and the proton are moving at 99% the speed of light. My first paper, I calculated that number. The second paper, I used that number. I needed that number to perform the calculations, prove that the three quarks moving at 99% the speed of light will generate the precise amount of mass that's found in a neutron and a proton. And I succeeded in doing that. I have the equations that will generate and predict the mass of the proton and neutron exactly. And so now I know the cause of gravity 1, which is the accelerated motion of unbalanced charges. And the unbalanced charges are the quarks inside the neutron and proton. Those items generate a mass, whereas the photon doesn't generate any mass because it's going always in a straight line.
Right.
It's accelerated. We know this for sure. It's a fact. No physicist will deny it. No physicist will deny that the photon is a massless particle. No physicist will deny it goes in a straight line. I've got the explanation why. Without any, the structure of the photon is a device that charges like what's a photon is made of two charges, a positive and a negative. They balance out, which makes the photon fly straight. Charges like an electron or an anti-electron, they're clockwise or counterclockwise rotations of space. They're persistent. They don't dissolve. And so they'll curl when they move. They'll curl when they move. And that curved motion generates their mass. So as they're going around the proton or a neutron in an atom, they're moving in an accelerated fashion because they're going around. And that's where it gets its mass from. That's why electrons have mass. But that's never the case with photons. They never move like that, always straight. And that was one of my discoveries, that photons don't generate mass because they move in a straight line, because they're balanced charges. That's in my book. And I make the arguments to support that. So now we have a method for generating mass, which is unbalanced charges moving in an accelerated or curved motion. And not only are they moving in this shape, but the shape is rolling and spinning. It means the ultimate shape of is a sphere. The ultimate shape of a neutron or a proton is a spherical dot, which is what we see in electron microscopes. That's what they appear to be. Dots, very small, very concentrated, dots with a mass. And I've now just explained to you why they have mass. And so we're at the point where I put in my book the explanation for gravity 1. Now we're going to get to what everybody's really, really, really super interested in, is gravity 2.
Yes.
And anti-gravity, because that's how UFOs fly. I don't care which one you pick, unless you pick one that's an interdimensional craft. That mechanism of motion is entirely different. They're skipping or through dimensions, and there are infinite amount of dimensions, and there's an infinite amount of universes. So I'm not going to get into all that. I get into it a little bit in my book on stargates, but they use stargate technology. I'm talking about the everyday common, most UFOs that you see in the atmosphere are use this technology, which is either they emit a very powerful magnetic field, which we know from the early days of UFOlogy that people noticed immense magnetic fields coming off of these early ships, or they use electrostatic fields, big charges like Tesla used to get in the millions of volts. So you need a capacitor that can hold a charge of a million or more volts. And when you have that kind of capacitor, according to T.T. Brown, if you configure it with the positive upside
You're
facing
back
up
again.
Earth and the negative side down, it's lighter. And the higher the voltage you use, the lighter it gets, the more propulsion is applied to the capacitor. At some point, you get break even where it floats. At higher voltages, it actually thrusts upward. And that's where the disinformation of the United States government has confused everybody, because they kept steering that notion away, even though he kept stressing it over and over again in all of his experiments that that's true. So I thought to myself, well, I'm an electronic technician by trade.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to get into high voltages because they can damage your house. They could damage your neighbor's house. You could damage the transformers outside. You got to be very careful. And I knew I was going to need a high voltage. So I went the magnetic field route. So I thought to myself, if in fact this is true, the magnetic field, the dipole, if you go out to the internet and look at a magnet, you'll see lines of force coming out one end and going into the other end. This is very common. And what you'll see normally is lines of force coming out of the North Pole and going into the South Pole. So that contradicts the theory that the North Pole will output an attractive force, and the South Pole will attract. No, my theory says the North Pole is attractive, but it's the reverse in the common theory of electronics and electric physics. That realm, the physicists who did all the equations for magnetism and current flow have the lines reversed. Because I thought to myself, when I did the experiment, it backed up what Thomas Brown said. If I pointed the magnet up, North Pole up, it's lighter than when I flipped it and pointed it down. So that confirmed his theory. Then the next thing I did was build an electromagnet and did it at different currents, and noticed that whenever I turned on the current with the North Pole up, the magnet got lighter, for sure. And when I flipped the poles, the magnet was still lighter, but not as much, which tells you that the anti-gravity field is still present, making the magnet light, but the configuration for thrusting was wrong. So I did my bunches of experiments over months. Everyone confirmed that when the power was on and the magnetic pole was up, I isolated that magnet so that the scale was far away from the magnet. So the magnetic field wasn't affecting the scale at all. And it wasn't close to anything else I could pull it or push it.
Right.
So it's up and floating in space, and I build the thing to hold it, made of plastic, non-magnetic. And I turn on the magnet and I measured its weight. And son of a gun,
Oh,
every time, as soon as I turned it on, the magnet got lighter. There is really no explanation for that in current theory. And so I thought about it and I thought about it and I realized, like Bob Lazar said when he was working on that a UFO in the Area 51, that he noticed that at the top there was a gravitational field coming out of the gravity wave emitter. It was actually attracting his hand, and the repulsive part was on the bottom of the ship. So you could actually put a floor in, turn those magnets on, and that thing will float up, and you'll still feel a gravitational attraction to the floor. But what's attracting you is the gravity, inline gravity generated by the magnetic field. So when you travel inside of a UFO and you're using this technology, you're disconnected from the Earth's gravitational field. You're disconnected from the ether, the space, because a magnetic field and electrostatic field, both are twists of space and both pull space apart. So you go into your own realm. So when a UFO moves, it can move 10,000 miles an hour. And the only motion you feel is none, because you're not moving at a rate different than the bubble, the what I call the slip wave field. And so you feel no inertia, none. You don't get your head pulled back in the chair when you go forward. You don't feel the earth below. It's like you're floating. It's like you're massless, because you are massless, because that field generates, by virtue of its pulling space apart, an effect that disconnects you from mass, inertia, and gravity 1. It generates only gravity 2, which you can feel if you're on the North Pole side, and anti-gravity, which disconnects you from the Earth's gravitational pull below, and you can put additional thrusters along the rim to push the spaceship forward, or you could do like what Bob's spaceship did. It all flipped up and then moved like that. That's a very primitive design, but some of them do that. They flip the whole thing up and then move forward. I think there's better designs that can be built, but everything makes sense. But what Bob Lazar makes sense, what T.T. Brown says makes sense, and the theory now makes sense. That the only thing that doesn't make sense is that the lines of force that are drawn and the directions don't match what are in the textbooks. So I thought to myself, something's wrong here. These lines of force should be going in the other direction. And so I said, well, I'm going to find out who was the first one that said which way the current in a battery or charge is moving when you connect them was. Who determined that? And I did find out that it was Benjamin Franklin. And, where he would gather his charges in a bottle, positive charges and negative charges, and then he would connect them with a wire and he'd see a spark. And he took a guess. He said that electrons, or the electricity, they didn't know what it was yet. They didn't know about the electron until 150 years later, moves from the positive charge to the negative charge. And he was wrong. Unfortunately, nobody figured that out for 150 years, which means every theoretical physicist was using the wrong direction of current flow, so the wrong rotation. All the lines of force are backwards. And I found the proof, undeniable proof, that is true, what I just told you. Physicists know about it, but they chose not to make a big deal about it, because they would have to rewrite all the physics books and all that. So now I think matches reality. So when I draw a magnet, the lines of force are actually going into the North Pole, coming out of the South Pole. In is attractive, pulls it up.
Right.
South, repulsive, pushes it up. Both work together to give the spaceship propulsion. And when they're strong enough, either electrogravitically or magnetogravitically, you have a weightless ship that can go at incredible speeds. And when you get into deep space, you just keep turning up the juice. You not only can go the speed of light, you can go beyond the speed of light. You can go at any speed you desire. All you got to do is turn up the power so that now you have a spaceship that can go 20,000 times the speed of light, which is basically a minimum speed necessary to travel to other stars. Otherwise, you don't get there. If you travel just the speed of light, it takes years to get to the nearest star, 4.2. If you travel 10 or 20,000 times the speed of light, you get there in a couple of days. Now, that's what I'm talking about. Now, that's the kind of technology that'll allow aliens to get here. They may need to move way beyond the speed of light. So they need to have figured this out as well, and I'm sure they did. And I thought to myself, well, why didn't the people at the magnetic labs ever discover this? They surely must have thought of the idea. And I think they did. But I think what happened was the U.S. government, namely the U.S. Air Force, said, don't tell anybody that. That's classified. You're never going to tell anybody that, because if you do, we'll ruin you. And so they kept quiet. And they still to this day don't confirm that. But if everybody, the main, kids in labs could build powerful magnets and simply weigh them, they'll see the exact same thing I did, and they'll know the exact same truth that I know, that gravity and anti-gravity, gravity 2, which comes from the North Pole, it's a linear type, straight line gravity. It pulls straight toward the magnet, and anti-gravity pushes away. Those two things are generated by dipoles, either electrostatic dipoles or magnetic. And that's how you build a UFO. You just build a very powerful magnet or a very, very powerful capacity. It's just that simple. And it will always be that simple, no matter what the U.S. government says or what anybody else says in the media or whatever who don't really know, what modern day physicists don't really know, because they haven't done the experiment. They won't even consider it. They'll try to explain it away like they did with T.T. Brown and said, well, it's just ion propulsion. It's not really true anti-gravity. They were wrong.
Yeah. Do you think we've got alien technology now what can use anti-gravity?
Yeah. The U.S. government, I'm sure, has it. They reverse engineered the crafts and discovered this. But what I don't know that they discovered is the theory. I have the complete theory, and I was struck down before I could come up with the last equation for electrostatic fields, magnetic fields. I came up with the equation that explained particle motion, which is part of the unified field theory. You have to know what causes particle to move. And that paper is also on ResearchGate. And it works. I could take any photon, no matter what the wavelength, I could put it into my set of equations, and the answer that comes out is the speed of light every time. It adjusts when a photon actually has size. It could be, miles long or sub-micron, nanometers. very small. Smaller you get, the higher the energy. And when you do the computations normally, you should come up with different speeds because you have different energies, different mass, different speed. But I, what's the term, derived the equation that fixes this inaccurate statement. We need the photons to move just like God built them to move. So that means that when a photon has a longer wavelength, right in the middle between the positive and the negative charge is the start of the gravity anti-gravity field. And when you change its wavelength, you change that size. And that size determines in one of Newton's equations, gravitational equation, the rate of motion of that particle, the photon. And once you put that equation in and bolt it in and then take its output and put it into Newton's equation, I generate the light speed of light for every photon imaginable, no matter how large or how small. Just like we see in nature, a perfect match, a perfect explanation, and it's mechanical. Just like Einstein looked for. Well, he says, Einstein never looked for particle motion. Oh, yes, he did. I said, when I got the idea, I said, wait a minute. If I have to know particle motion in order to finish unified field theory, he must have realized this too. So I started reading through his papers. And in the unified field theory based on Riemann metrics and distance parallelism, the year 1930, at the last two sentences of that paper, he says this: nevertheless, I'm still far away from claiming the physical validity of the equations I derived. The reason for that is that I did not succeed in deriving equations of motions for particles yet. So he did know it too. So I was able to do that equation for the photon motion. And
Right.
it works beautifully. And that's on ResearchGate. And I only had 2 papers left to do, but unless I recover from this ailment, I don't know that I'll ever finish them. I may have to put them up there in an incomplete form and let somebody else who's very clever get the last equation. The equations I got don't work for all situations, so I know there's something wrong. And I need
Right.
data points. If I had more data points, I could finish the work.
There's spiders from Mars here. Element 115, he spoke about this and how it would be used as part of gravity harnessing propulsion for alien craft.
Yeah, that's Bob Lazar's claim, and it's possible if you could manufacture it at some way. See, in order to build an anti-gravity spacecraft that could go beyond the speed of light, you have to have an enormous amount of energy. So you have to have a power supply that can generate, either millions and millions of volts, which is what was needed for Bob's spaceship, or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of amps of current. That's much harder to do. But Bob's little thing, and I don't know if it was correct or not, somehow, some way, Bob Lazar got the information about how UFOs work. Whether he really worked on a spacecraft or he got it from somebody else. And there's a good chance he got it from Lear. And he was good friends with Lear's son. And Lear worked on, with the US, the navigational systems of the UFOs. So in order to do that, you have to know how they work in order to steer them. And it's possible, one, that Bob got his information then and made up a story, or two, he really did work in one of those labs, which was never really solidly proven. If you look into the background of Bob Lazar, it's pretty shaky. But somehow he knew a lot about the technology, and
He did.
I think it comes from Bob Lear or John Lear, where he got his information, which he used to make up his story. But the element 115, there's so many different ways I would imagine for alien technology to come up with some sort of 0 point technology. I think maybe that's just a different version, because you need electrons, a lot of electrons. And so whatever this thing was, however it worked, was able to strip electrons off of something and use them to develop the voltage. So I don't focus too much on the explanation of element 115 and his explanation, because I don't know for sure that he actually did work in a UFO. But I do know he, again, had the right size for the power system. It should be about the size of a basketball, because you can't really efficiently take in a nuclear system and try to fly a UFO with a nuclear generator. There would be a lot of radiation. It would be toxic to the astronauts, would not be reliable, and a lot of problems with it. But you would need essentially the amount of energy that's produced for New York City. You need a lot of power, and maybe not so much for an electrostatic version like the Bob Lazar version. You need much less power, much more energy, and that energy is stored as voltage. And you have enough voltage, you create a field in between the plates of the capacitor that's very powerfully strong and allows the anti-gravity gravity field to emerge from the two different poles. It's much easier to build an electrostatic UFO, electrostatic field UFO, than it is to build a magnetic. Because magnetic needs enormous amounts of power.
Right.
And that's not easy to generate. But the electrostatic ones, all you need is high voltage, and we know how to boost voltage without a whole lot of power. What you need is the field. The high voltage field is what generates the anti-gravity field. And we know how to do that, thanks to Tesla and other people who worked with coils and amplifiers and such. We can boost the voltage of that we supply DC voltage to a capacitor. And you really kind of need DC. AC is not appropriate. It's not the right field form to generate propulsion. Need DC, direct current. Charge builds up on one side and the other opposite charge builds up on the other side. And so that creates these huge electrostatic field. I don't know if you ever played with a Van de Graaff generator, but you know how it makes a big spark, like the lightning. That's the kind of energy you need, voltage-wise, to build an anti-gravity craft. And so, that's all I can say about element 115 and so forth. I don't know that it does exist now, but it can only be made artificially. And I don't know, you got to find a way to make it stable. It's an isotope, and normally it's not stable.
It's not stable.
No. So you would have to find a way for it to have a controlled reaction.
Right.
I'm reading what's on the line here.
There's Jar Jar here in the chat room. He says, light does not exist in the physical universe. It occupies no volume in space and has no mass.
the first two parts of the statement are wrong. The last part of the statement is why it has no mass is not understood unless you use my theory. It has no mass because it has
Right.
balanced charge, which then you will find physicists say photons have no charge, so they have no mass. But what they don't realize is photons do have charge. They have a positive and a negative charge that are equal, and mathematically they cancel. And they have taken that to mean that photons just don't have charge. That's not true. Photons do have charge. They have opposite equal amounts that don't cancel. So you don't do the math 1 minus 1 equals 0 for charge. You do, to define a photon, you say 1 plus a minus 1, and you don't finish the equation. That's the photon. That's the charge. That's how it should be described. So for that statement, the first part is wrong. They do occupy physical space, and it occupies no volume of space. No, that's wrong. They do. And they have no mass. And I just explained why they have no mass, because they have balanced charge that flies in a straight line. So that's all the answers to that statement. Any others out there?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, everybody, feel free to.
Yeah, I know Rebecca says, I know she said, I wish I could ask him a question, a really good question, but I haven't got the technology with me.
Let me straighten this out.
Yeah, just straighten yourself up a bit.
Yeah, it's just uncomfortable sitting. You got backache problems. Well, we talked about, we got 15 minutes left. I talked about all science.
But yeah, about that. Yeah.
That there's a spiritual side to this too. Nobody coming to Earth would just be randomly picked to come across this information. You got to be chosen. You got to agree to it in your life plan. And so your guardian angels, which I have had contact with on various times in my life, will work with you to achieve your goals, no matter what they are. And that's true for everyone. So I'm perfectly happy about talking about God, there is a God. Jesus, there is a Jesus. The afterlife, there is an afterlife. And all of that is open for discussion, because in my theory, the theory of super relativity, all science, all that exists comes from God. And so even the ether is the primary field, the fundamental field, is that which something that is either a part of God, consubstantial with God, or was generated by, and there's debates about which way they could be. It was generated by God at some point in order to create a universe. Because the universe, in order to exist as a physical universe, has to have something that physically exists, not just spiritually. So the one thing that makes all this universe work is the fact that space is a real thing. It's a real physical thing. And how do I know that for sure? Well, space is not empty. It may not be filled with particles, but the space itself is a thing. It's a quasi-elastic solid that was obviously developed by the creator. And how do I know? Well, it takes light 8.5 minutes to get from the sun to Earth. If space were made of nothing, as many scientists would say, then it would take 0 time for a particle of light to get from the surface of the sun to the Earth. And we never see that. We never see that. It always takes about 8.5 or I don't know, 8.5 or 11.5, one or the other, minutes to get to Earth. That means that the distance between the sun and the Earth is a real physical thing, because the time interval appears because it takes the light particle to travel across this quasi-elastic solid at a specific rate, at a specific distance. It takes a specific amount of time, and that's exactly what we see. Science itself verifies that space is a real thing. They just don't accept it. It's just not an interpretation that the other side is willing to accept. But it's right there. It's the truth. And so that's an important point that
There's
I make.
a question now for you. No, there's a question here for you. Compare the original IBM to current cell phone, and the craft has no conduit for transmission of controls or effort. Explain how that was possible, and I might entertain the fact that you don't think.
IBM to a current cell phone. I don't really know what that is exactly. And the craft that has no conduit for transmission of controls or effort. Explain how that was possible. I might entertain the fact that you don't think. So there's some, I guess he's looked at this, he's familiar with this technology, and I guess he thinks he sees something in it that suggests a way for UFOs to work. Am I right in what I guess here, Michael? Is that what you're saying? That you know of
I think so. I know he's just put something else. The propulsion system is improbable.
Which propulsion system? The one that I described, or the one that this IBM cell phone technology describes?
I think so. Yeah.
I can't really talk to the cell phone. What he's
I'll see if he gets back to us on that.
Yeah. So in my book, I pretty much describe the mechanics of the universe in Gravity 1, how it works. It's all attractive. That sphere. And I will tell you that idea that I'm describing, that I got to, really comes from Einstein. He had the same idea, the rotating sphere. And I'll read a passage from Amir Excel's book entitled God's Equation. It's about Einstein and his work in gravity. And so his idea for gravity or general relativity comes from special relativity. Einstein followed a line of reasoning that began with the happiest thought of his life. Still at the Swiss Patent Office, he conducted one of his famous thought experiments. Einstein imagined a circle spinning in space. The center of the circle did not move, but its circumference was moving quickly in a circular direction. That's accelerated motion. Einstein compared what happens in several reference frames, a standard tool he had used in developing the special relativity theory. He concluded, using his special relativity, that the boundary of the disk contracted as it spun. As it gets toward the speed of light, that contraction becomes considerable, and mass will be generated. I agree with that. There was a force acting on the circle at the boundary of this, and that force he thought was the centrifugal force. I'm not sure if that's right or not, but I'll let that go. But the force that I was thinking was really more along the force of what came out of Lorenz's equations. And its action was analogous to that of the gravitational force. But that same contraction that affected the outer circle left the diameter unchanged. Thus, Einstein concluded in a way that surprised even him the ratio of the circle to the diameter was no longer pi. He deduced that the presence of a gravitational field, force field, the geometry of space was non-Euclidean, it was bent. In other words, space wasn't just a flat grid with parallel lines running to infinity. When a gravitational force is present, the lines get bent and there's a contraction. That contraction leads to the generation of an increase in mass, and the increase of mass, and these are all in the Lorentz equations, generates the mass of that object. Even though it's sitting perfectly still, the particles that make up the neutron or proton are moving within the neutron and the proton at 99% the speed of light. That's all that's necessary to create ordinary gravity. And so planets, stars, all objects that have mass, that's how they do it. They emit from themselves a contraction only gravity one field, which is basically a pulling of space toward the center of that object mass. And so
Right.
center of the planet, center of the sun, everything is pulled toward it. So space is attracted to and pulled toward it. And then other things with mass interact with that field and are attracted to the larger gravitational field, or they are put in motion by the cause of the emitted gravitational field of the sun or the planet or whatever. That's why we have a constant pull toward these objects. So that's the
Right.
explanation, in more detail for gravity. I realize there's a lot to digest here scientifically, but there'll be people, technical people, that will understand every bit of what I said. And it will just be a matter of
I'm sure there will be, Mark.
believing what I said. It's not a matter of understanding. For most people, it'll be a matter of, can that really be that simple? Can that really be that true? Should I try the experiment he describes? The electromagnet? Should I build my own electromagnet and weigh it? That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for them to do that. And so they will see for themselves that what I said is true. And there's only one real sensible explanation for that, and I've given it tonight or today in this.
You are.
Any
You
more
have,
questions?
Mark. Rebecca just said, absolutely fascinating. I hope the right people hear this.
I
I'm
hope
sure
I
they
can.
will do.
Yeah, it's
You've
been a lot.
explained it absolutely great tonight.
Well, thank you. I got to try to do the best I can to get this out there. I don't do many podcasts anymore
Yes,
because
true.
it's really hard for me to sit here and there's a considerable amount of pain
I
involved.
know, Mark. I can imagine so.
Pray to God that somebody gets
But
this.
I'm glad.
If we do this,
I
Robert,
do.
if we do this, if we succeed, we'll have spaceships that can go to other stars. We'll meet, and the government, is not going to be able to tell everybody that goes to a different planet to shut up or we'll kill you. That'll be too many people, too many countries doing it. When we have this revelation, this realization that there are other people, are other planets, the joining of religion and science will happen. And once again, the two will be one, as all science really comes from God. And I could tell you, it was said by many near-death experiencers. I'll give you one for example, very clearly, this is Father Rick Wendell, a Catholic priest who at the time of his near-death experience was not a priest yet. He became a priest after the near-death experience. While he was there speaking to God, God tells him, I have only one commandment for man, love one another. All of the three-dimensional world is within God. There is nothing outside of God. Everything within this physical universe has to correspond to laws, and God set those laws. They are immutable as God's immutable. None of this, what we see and experience, is an accident. It is intentioned by God. I can't say it any more clearly and succinctly than that. That's how the universe works.
Exactly.
That's always how it's going to work. Whether mankind accepts that or not, that's just the way it is. It would be better for us to understand that.
So true.
Well, what better source of information can you have?
Exactly. Where, Mark, where can people get your books?
Oh, go to my website, www.super-relativity.com, super-relativity.com. And I have links, buttons that you can go to my papers, and you can go to buy my book on Amazon, or you can order one if you want a signed copy, but that's going to be more difficult for me to do now. But with my health condition, I just recommend going to Amazon, and it's easy, just one or two clicks and you bought the book. I have a link on my website. You can go directly to Amazon. I have some videos there, Father Rick Wendell's video I recommend you watch. I have some other shows. I would like to upload this show to my site when I get the link. I will do that so people can see this entire explanation. It's important. People need to do the experiment. They must do the experiment to find the truth. And it's not a hard experiment to do if you have any kind of electrical engineering background. I beg you to do this experiment. The sooner we know this, the better our world will be. There'll be cures coming from the aliens that we encounter, cures for disease, longevity of life, peace, and they will tell you that there is a God too. And they'll explain that God is a universal being. And, we'll have no reason to fight wars anymore. It'll be a peaceful planet. And we will be a peaceful people. This is my wish. This is what I pray for. Please do the experiment.
Yes. I'm sure they will do, Mark. So thank you for coming on the show. It's been a very fascinating show, and I'm glad you've got it out there.
I'll go out as long as I can. Hopefully, I'm trying new drugs and such treatments that will hopefully strengthen my body more and have less pain. Then I can get out and about more. I can get back to work on my final two papers. I would like to finish those. That would complete the entire unified field theory. I have the old theory completed, but this new theory, the super relativity theory, includes anti-gravity, which the old theory did not. But in truth, it should have had that. But that was thinking way ahead of where they were back in those early days, in the early 1900s, 1950, 1960. Nobody really had a clue. Anti-gravity was a joke. And now we know better. There's been enough demonstrations of these vehicles to know they're not using normal propulsion. They're not using jets, rockets, propellers. They're using an electromagnetic form of propulsion. And we need to take that technology. It could be used to build super ambulances and super trucks, things that could deliver products and services and save lives in a matter of minutes, not days or hours. An ambulance can fly straight up, point to the place where the sick person is, fly there within seconds, land, work on the person, get them back to the hospital. This could be done under 5 minutes. This could be done under 2 minutes. It's going to save lives. We need this technology. Please do the experiment that I described.
Just a quick one here. Somebody just wrote in chat room here. All you need is a copper centrifugal flywheel and 3-axis rotations. It will counteract the Earth's magnetic fields by using Lenz's law.
That may or may not be true. I don't know. That's not an area that I have studied in. The centrifugal flywheel has some interesting properties. And if you've got current going through it, that make it even more interesting, I'm sure. So they probably have a point there, but that's not really, as far as I know, an alternative solution to what I'm saying. My system is very simple, straightforward, mechanical, and
yes,
there's probably other ways to do it, more sophisticated, that aliens have thought of, or maybe this what you say here is a possible way that the flywheel in motion with current moving could in fact create some sort of anti-gravity field. Maybe, I don't know. It's not any experiment that I've done, and there may be somebody else out there has done it. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So thank you, Mark, for coming on the show. Everybody's sending lots of prayers and blessings to you from the chat room. God bless Mark. Prayers and blessings sent to Mark.
Prayers are helpful.
So very interesting. Thank you again, Mark. Mark, I really enjoyed tonight's show.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Glad to be here. Glad to get the message out.
And I'll send you the link. Yeah, and I'll send you the link as soon as the show finishes. I'll get it over to you.
All righty. Thank you.
Just end the show now. Thank you, Mark. Very interesting, as always.